Hello, welcome to chapter one of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be reading the first chapter, and I'll be stopping quite regularly to talk you through some of the main points of either context or language, or pulling together some of the most important parts of the story. One of the most significant things to bear in mind in this is the narrative perspective. Now, the majority of the book, the first 8 chapters, certainly out of 10 chapters, they are told from a third person narrative perspective, which means that it's an outsider who's looking in, who's observing the story, who has nothing to do with it. It could perhaps be the author, it could just be some anonymous voice. However, as often happens with third person narrative, the first character that we often meet, that we're introduced to in a story, is the person whose bias we take. So we perhaps follow their story a little bit more than others. And that's significant because we are introduced to a man called Mr. Utterson, who we'll find out a little bit more about in a moment. Now, Utterson's important because he sort of becomes our link between the story and between the reader. He sort of asks a lot of the questions that we might want to ask. He finds out things at the same rate that we do. So in many ways, he becomes our detective in the story. Just a couple of things to fill you in on. The book was written at the end of the 1800s, which means that it's late 19th century, and that falls into the late Victorian period. Now, the Victorian period spanned from sort of 1837, when Queen Victoria took the throne, until she died in 1901. But obviously, it spans sort of a little bit after that because her influence was very widely felt. And the Victorian era was renowned as a hugely significant time in terms of progression of the way that people worked and the way that people lived. Huge steps forward in science and medicine, and the very early beginnings of our understanding of the brain and the way that the brain works and our personality and things like that, what we call psychoanalysis. And the Victorian era as well was very, very religious because there were so many changes going on in society that people wanted something that they could hold on to, that they could have faith in. So it was a hugely religious time as well. And one of the biggest sort of confrontations that developed during the late period was this confrontation between religion and science, and the belief that each of them kind of contradicted the other. The main development really occurred in the 1860s when a man called Charles Darwin, who you might have heard of, published his theory that was called On the Origin of Species. And it was what we know today as the theory of evolution, the belief that as humans, we didn't just land on Earth one day in the form that we are now, that we did actually evolve over millions and millions of years, with our most direct ancestors in the animal kingdom, of course, being apes. And Charles Darwin did an awful lot of research over a number of years, finding sort of skeletons and piecing together evidence from across the world that proved his theory. Now, of course, this goes in direct opposition to the teachings of God, of religion, in the belief that mankind was made directly in God's image. So if you think about it, people that believed in these scientific developments were seen to be blasphemous, to be going against the church. They were sacrilegious because everything that God that had been taught in terms of God's teaching was directly contradicted by this belief that we evolved, and that the scientific footprints could be seen throughout time and could be proven. So there was an awful lot of I suppose a battle between science and religion that developed over the period. And because of this, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was kind of it was quite a significant book in that respect, in that it does kind of look at undeveloped or certainly animalistic human qualities. But we'll come to that a bit more as we read through it. But that's quite an important point to note. Okay. So we've got a third person narrative perspective, but it takes the point of view of Mr. Utterson, who's the first character that we meet. It's also significant to note that if the actual events of the story span several years before the novel actually begins. So we kind of join the events probably about halfway through. We aren't told about the background to things. The background to the events and all the final bits of the puzzle and the jigsaw are pieced together in the end 2 chapters, which are told from the point of view of 2 specific characters in the novel. Okay, so Utterson It's kind of a bit like a detective for us as the reader. He spans the bridge between the events of the book and us as the reader. So as we find out things, it's because Utterson has found out things. So where there are gaps in our knowledge, it's because Utterson hasn't found them out yet. So even though he's not a detective, he's a lawyer, he's told lots of different pieces of information by different people, and he sort of slowly pieces it together for himself, and obviously for the benefit of the reader as well, because we follow his story in the third person narrative. Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beckoned from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. Now, right from the beginning, then, that the fact that the whole chapter begins, the whole novel begins with the name of Mr. Utterson, that's what I mean by we are drawn to his story. And from the beginning, he seems Stevenson presents him as quite a serious man. It doesn't seem to be particularly welcoming. It describes him using words like that he had a rugged countenance. Countenance is another word for your face or your expression, so it's quite rugged. So it looks quite weathered, quite worn. It said that it was never lighted by a smile, so it shows he's quite serious. It describes him as cold, scanty. Scanty means lacking in things. Embarrassed in discourse meant that he was embarrassed to talk to people. Um, Long, lean, dusty, dreary. So it's all quite negative. And yet, at the end of that very first lengthy sentence, it says, and yet somehow lovable. So there's something about him that makes him, there's a warmth about him that perhaps does shine through a little bit. It talks about how at friendly meetings, so perhaps at dinner parties, when the wine was to his taste, so perhaps he'd been drinking, something eminently human beckoned from his eye. There's perhaps a twinkle in his eye. There's something deeper within Mr. Utterson's character that isn't at first evident, and that people don't perhaps always see. Um, but he's quite a serious man, but there's obviously a lighter side to him. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and an extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. Now, what this means is, if he was austere with himself, it means he was quite stern or quite strict with himself. So he drinks gin rather than sort of vintage ports. Port was is still a very very strong alcoholic drink, and it often made people quite ill. They believed that they gave them something called gout, which was associated with people that drank quite a lot or had quite a rich diet. It also says that even though he enjoyed the theatre, he hadn't crossed the doors of one for 20 years. So it seems as though this is a man that enjoys nice things in life, but doesn't let himself indulge in them. And this was quite typical of the Victorians who held this view that in society you have to be quite strict and quite moral and quite upright. However, for a lot of Victorians, this was just a facade. It was a mask, and actually behind closed doors, they led quite debauched, quite sinful lives. But on the outside, it was all about people looking and playing the part. Perhaps much more so than we do today. And it also says here that he had an approved tolerance for others. So even though he doesn't perhaps indulge in sinful activities himself, he doesn't disprove. He doesn't look down on other people that do things that perhaps are described as a little bit sinful or a little bit immoral. I incline to Cain's hearsay, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. Now, we have the first reference to the Bible here, where it refers to Cain's hearsay. Now, Cain and Abel were brothers in the Bible, and one of the brothers, Abel, went bad. And Cain's view, where he says here, "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way," means that one man lets his fellow man sort of do what he wants. If he wants to do something sinful, he's not going to look down on them. He's not going to judge them. Okay, and so what it's saying about Utterson here is that he doesn't judge his friends. He doesn't do sort of sinful things or immoral things himself, but he doesn't stop other people doing it. If they want to do it, he's okay with that. And he says here that it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. In other words, he was often the last friend that people had if they went a bit wayward, if they went off the rails. So he doesn't judge people. He's not one to say, if you don't change your ways, I'm going to stop being your friend. He remains with them, and obviously he's quite supportive, but he doesn't judge them, but he doesn't do these things himself. So this is a man who's, right from the start, he's seen as somebody quite sensible, someone quite austere and serious, but actually someone who's very, very dependable and whose friends often rely on him quite a lot. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in the similar catholicity of good nature. It's the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. In other words, it's saying that Mr. Utterson perhaps found it easy not to judge people because he was undemonstrative. And if you're undemonstrative, it means that you don't show your feelings. He's not very emotional, it seems. So he's a man that doesn't particularly show his emotions at all. And he's also a very modest man. And it goes on to talk about his friends and the way that he made friends. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They employed no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. In other words, a lot of Mr. Utterson's friends, it refers to them as those of his own blood, so perhaps relatives or cousins, um, people that he knows already, he already has in his family life. And it says, or those whom he had known the longest. So he's not one to kind of make new friends very easily. These are people that he's known for a very, very long time, that perhaps are quite trustworthy, and that he can that trust in him as well. So we're introduced to a second character here, Mr. Richard Enfield, and it refers to him as uh, like ivy that had grown over time. So this is a very long and well-established friendship. But the writer Stevenson goes on to talk about, to the outside eye, the friendship between Mr. Utterson, whose name's Gabriel, so Gabriel Utterson and Richard Enfield seems quite unusual, and people can't quite understand why at first glance they are friends. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them on their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. So it's saying here that to the outside eye, it's quite confusing as to why these two men are friends, because they don't seem to have very much in common. And it says here that they, when they were seen out and about together, they looked singularly dull, that they said nothing, and they would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. In other words, they didn't really talk to each other. They both looked quite miserable, and they were relieved if they came across somebody else that they knew they could have a conversation with. Now, this is an important context point here, that obviously they didn't have the sort of entertainments that the range of entertainments that we do today, as a society. Um, Gentlemen like these would certainly not have been seen in a pub. It would have been seen as immoral. It would have been a place of vice and sin. Um, they would have had sort of gentlemen's clubs, which would have been quite exclusive, for the wealthier classes, the upper classes. And often people that were members of these clubs, it was a case of what went on behind closed doors was very, very secret. So they could drink, they could talk about what they wanted to talk about, but it was certainly all kept behind closed doors, and nothing would ever have been revealed about. So what a big element of Victorian society of wealthy gentlemen like these was that they would often take weekend strolls, usually on a Sunday afternoon, and they'd be seen out and about in important places around London. In this case, this is where they live, and they would perhaps spend several hours just walking around talking. And it was a way, it was almost the way that I suppose we today, you might take photographs and put them on your social media, on your Instagram, your Snapchat, whatever, to show people what you're up to. And this is what they will, this is exactly why they're doing this. It's their way of being seen in society as being good men doing the right thing, out walking, taking the fresh air, and talking to each other. So this is quite an important contextual point. It chanced on one of these rambles, that's another word for walk, on one of these rambles that their way led down a by street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along these thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So we see Utterson and Enfield here, whose walk this one particular Sunday takes them down a by street. A by street just means a smaller street. And it's described here by Stevenson in very, very positive terms. It's saying that it kind of stands out amongst in the streets around it. It talks about that the inhabitants were all doing well and emulously hoping to do better still. So the people that perhaps own the shops down here, that live down here, are very proud of where they live. It talks about that they laying out their gains in coquetry. Coquetry just means quite a fancy way, so they perhaps lay out their goods and things that they were trying to sell, and it was all in a very nice way, in a very appealing way, and it's a very nice place to be. And it says that even on a Sunday when it lay empty of passage, in other words, it wasn't very busy, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood like a fire in a forest. So this one particular street stands out amongst the others as being somewhere that where the people that live there have pride in where they live, and they're trying to do better for themselves, do well for themselves. Two doors from one corner on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors to repair their ravages. So this is where the reader's interest would be suddenly piqued. So you would show a little bit more interest because it talks about the door. Now we know that this door has got to be important because the title of the chapter is Story of the Door. And if you notice, look at the way that Stevenson's language changes here. The street around it is described in very positive terms. It talks about the polished brasses, the freshly painted shutters, and yet suddenly the building that this door is situated is described in very negative terms. Look at the language. We've got words like it talks about a certain sinister block thrust forward. It talks about it showed no window, nothing but a door, and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper. The fact that it has no windows in the back of this building suggests that nobody is able to see out or in. So there's something quite secret about it. It talks about it was equipped with neither bell nor knocker. So there's no way of you actually trying to get anybody inside to come and answer the door. So again, it gives a sense of secrecy and perhaps there's something behind it that's been hidden. It talks about the fact that it was blistered and disdained, so it's not being looked after at all. Tramps have slouched in the recess. The recess just means the door frame. It talks about the damage that schoolboys have perhaps done with their knives, and no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. In other words, it seems that perhaps nobody lives there, or certainly there's nobody inside that's bothered about what's going on outside. So there's an element of secrecy, but also maybe an element of interest here, because if there's a door there that nobody seems to have gone out in and out of for years, and that stands out as being very different to the surroundings in a very negative way, it will perhaps make us wonder who lives there and why it is so neglected. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former, that's Mr. Enfield, lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed," said Mr. Utterson, with a slight change of voice, "and what was that?" Now, this is where the door itself becomes important because Mr. Enfield, when they walk past the door, it reminds him of something that he needs to tell Mr. Utterson about. And so that the next little bit of narrative that we have for the next few paragraphs is direct speech that's told from Mr. Enfield to Mr. Utterson. All right, so Mr. Enfield is telling Utterson a little piece of the story, and it's this story that he tells him that begins Utterson's interest in the people that are involved, the things that are happening. So, as I said, the next couple of paragraphs here are the direct words of Mr. Enfield. So, this is the cousin to Mr. Utterson. Now, Mr. Enfield isn't a very important character. He only appears in it briefly once more in the rest of the novel. But he's a pivotal character in that it's the information that he gives to Mr. Utterson on this walk that begins the whole story. It sets everything else in motion. Okay, so this is an important moment, even though it's right at the start of the story, because it's this that sets everything else in motion. Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way led through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps, street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. So, the first part of the story that Enfield tells is about the fact that it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was on his way back from somewhere and walking through town. Now, the street lamps were only introduced fairly late in the Victorian era, and they're introduced actually as predominantly as a way of cutting down crime, because a lot of crime happened at night when people couldn't see. And in pretty much all literature, nighttime and darkness are always associated with evil deeds. And in fact, nearly all of the wicked deeds that take place do so in this novel at nighttime. Okay. So even Mr. Enfield says that it was so dark and so late that he began to wish for the sight of a policeman. So even a gentleman like him, who should be seen as quite strong and quite powerful, even he was perhaps feeling a little bit uneasy about being at this place at so late a night. All at once I saw two figures. One, a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able to down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing. For the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds like nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. So the story that he tells then is that as he's walking through these streets, he's heading towards like a crossroad where there's perhaps two roads that intersect, two pathways, and he's able from his position to see what happens. So there's a man running in one direction and a little girl running in another, and they bang into each other at the corner of the street because they can't see the other coming. And the little girl falls over, and rather than helping her up, this strange man tramples right over her. And it refers to as trampled on her calmly over the child's body. Now, don't be thinking that the child is dead because it describes her body, because it's not. She's fine, she's conscious, she's just a little bit injured. But the fact that, again, we have to go think about context, the fact that a gentleman would not be expected to behave in such a way. And it's also interesting that Stevenson chooses to have a little girl that he runs into, because the juxtaposition between a gentleman and a little girl is quite it's quite a significant sort of difference. And if a man were to have accidentally banged into a little girl and knocked her over, we would expect him to help her up and to apologise and make sure she was okay, rather than trampling over her. And look at the language that Stevenson uses. He says that he trampled calmly over the child's body. So there's something very cold and very calculated here, especially as he left her screaming on the ground. Enfield also describes this man as a damned juggernaut. Now, we think the word today normally is juggernaut. We normally associate it with a lorry. Obviously, there weren't lorries around at this time. But a juggernaut just means something that's very, very big and powerful, a large, powerful object. So this is a powerful man who trampled over this little girl and left her screaming on the ground. Okay. I gave a view holler. Holler just means a shout, so shouted after the man. I gave a view holler, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she'd been sent put in his appearance. So Enfield then explains to Utterson how he went running after this man. He shouted for him to stop. He collared him, so he grabbed him and then brought him back to where this little girl was on the floor, where by this point there's a crowd around her, perhaps her family. And it says that he was perfectly cool and made no resistance, which seems a little bit unusual. But it also says that he gave him one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. Now, this is a common occurrence that takes place, is that whenever people see this man, who I'll tell you now, it turns out to be Edward Hyde, every time that people see Edward Hyde for the first time, they all describe about the way it makes his face, his features make them feel very, very uneasy. I won't go into the details of why that is now, but it's a very, very significant point, the fact that people feel very uneasy when they see him. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the Sawbones, and there you might suppose would be an end to it. A sawbones is an old-fashioned word for a doctor, obviously someone that would saw bones. So the doctor that came out, this is not Dr. Jekyll, by the way. This is just some random sort of doctor that was called out, that came out and just took the child up to make sure that she was okay. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight, and so had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. So this is the doctor that turns up. Again, this isn't Dr. Jekyll. This is just the doctor that comes and checks over the girl. And when it describes him as emotional as a bagpipe, it means that this is a man that isn't emotional. There's nothing particularly significant about him. However, Enfield is really struck by this doctor's reaction when he sees this gentleman, this Mr. Edward Hyde. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with a desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. Now, this is another important contextual factor. We'll talk a bit more about the Victorian gentleman at some other point. But one of the key things about Victorian gentlemen of class and of status and wealth was their reputation. Reputation is something that if your reputation was damaged, you could never get it back. People wouldn't do business with you. People wouldn't want to associate with you. So if a gentleman's reputation is threatened, or is destroyed, it's a very, very serious thing. So Mr. Enfield and the doctor that turned out to check over the little girl both kind of threaten this man, Edward Hyde, and basically they're trying to get compensation out of him for the little girl for what he's done and how he's treated her. And for her family, and that they threaten him with making a stink. They can make his name stink from one end of London to the other. In other words, they're threatening him and his reputation unless he puts right these actions of running into this little girl and trampling over her and then running away. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, but they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces, and there was the man in the middle with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off so, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I'm naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. So the words that have just been said here were actually from this gentleman himself, who turns out to be Edward Hyde. And look at the language that Stevenson uses. It talks about a black, sneering coolness. We have lots of references to black because it's all to do with the devil and to do with sin. But it also notes as well that he's frightened too. And we have to ask ourselves, somebody that's able to trample over a little girl so calmly and so coolly, why he would be frightened. And we find out later it's because he was concerned about his reputation and about this going further. And we'll find out later why that is. And as he says here, if you choose to make capital out of this accident, capital means money, I am helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid scene. In other words, any gentleman would want to avoid a damage to his reputation, doesn't want a scene being made out of it. So he says, name your figure. So tell me how much money you want. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. £100 would have been an awful lot of money at this time. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck a deal, he struck a bargain of £100. The next thing was to get the money. And where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? So this is the door that's significant to the title of the chapter. So they had to get the money out of him, and he took them to this door in this by street. He whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance at Coutts's. Coutts is known for Big Bank. Drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story. But it was a name at least very well known and often printed. So we have quite an important point in terms of the mystery here, is that Mr. Enfield, when he's telling Utterson the story, says that the name whose name it is that's on the cheque that this mystery man, Edward Hyde, gives to the little girl's family, is a name who he doesn't mention just yet. So as a reader, we're wondering who this is. Why is it that he can't tell us the name of the writer of the text just yet? What's significant about it? So as a reader, we'd be getting quite intrigued as to who this might be. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that, if it were only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out of it with another man's cheque for close upon £100. So Enfield is telling Utterson here how he was quite suspicious of it, because it seems strange that one man would go into the back entrance of a house and come out with a cheque written in another man's name for a lot of money. So the whole thing seems very, very suspicious, and this is why they decide to go with him the next morning to the bank to cash the cheque to make sure that it's genuine. But he was quite easy and sneering. "Set your mind at rest," says he. "I will stay with you until the bank's open and cash the cheque myself." So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. And next day, when we breakfasted, we went in a body to the bank. I gave him the cheque myself and said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery, but not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. Now, Enfield keeps calling him my man and my friend. He's talking about the mystery man, this Mr. Hyde here. And when he's saying our friend, he's using it in quite an ironic way, because, of course, he doesn't necessarily know the name of this man. "Tut, tut," said Mr. Utterson. "I see you feel as I do," said Mr. Enfield. "Yes, it's a bad story. For my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of the proprietors. Celebrated too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good." So Enfield here comments on the fact that the man that brought the cheque out, so the man that ran into the little girl, Mr. Hyde, is a really damnable man. Now, when we use the word damnation, it's a reference to hell and the devil, which today to us doesn't seem anything significant, but back in this time it was very, very anti-religious, very blasphemous to be talking about the devil and relating people to the devil. So the fact that this Mr. Hyde is being described as damnable is being contrasted to the person whose name was on the cheque. And Enfield refers to him as a person who is the very pink of proprietaries and celebrated too, and one of your fellows who do what they call good. In other words, the man whose name is on the cheque, whose money it is a very good, honest person. So we've got this contrast between the two, the person who wrote the cheque and the person who's given them the cheque. So Enfield continues. "Blackmail, I suppose. An honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call that place with a door, in consequence. Though even that, you know, is far from explaining all," he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. Now, this idea of blackmail was something that would have been quite prevalent, so quite common in the Victorian era, especially for men of wealth and of status who perhaps had done something a little bit unsavoury in their past. Now, things that we see as being that they would have seen as being wrong, we perhaps wouldn't see as being particularly bad now. So perhaps going out and getting drunk, maybe getting into a fight, something like that. People, gentlemen in particular, men who because we're in a patriarchal society, which is a society which is ruled by men. So men of wealth and status and class and education would want to preserve their reputation at all costs. So Enfield here is assuming that the man whose name it is on the cheque, the good man, has perhaps done something in his youth that's been found out by this very unpleasant man, the man that ran into the little girl, and he's blackmailing him. All right, which I said will be quite a common thing for people to do on the quiet. If perhaps somebody a little bit seedy, a little bit unpleasant, found out something about somebody wealthy and rich with a good reputation, they'll blackmail them in order to get money out of them and threaten to destroy their reputation, which they couldn't afford to have happen. This goes back into third person narrative now. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson, asking rather suddenly, "And you don't know if the drawer of the cheque lives there?" "A likely place, isn't it?" returned Enfield. "But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you never asked about the place with the door?" said Mr. Utterson. So Utterson and Enfield here are talking about this door where the unpleasant door where the cheque was bought from, and Utterson is asking if the person that drew the cheque, who wrote the cheque, lives there, and Enfield says no, he lives somewhere else. Now I'm letting you into a little bit of a secret here. It turns out that the front part of the house where Dr. Jekyll lives, and this is the person who we find out in a minute whose name is on the cheque. Dr. Jekyll, who's the good man, he lives in a big house in a big square, in Cavendish Square. All right, and it turns out that the door that they're talking about here is actually a back door into his property. But because of the way that a lot of the streets are around London, because they're very, very crowded, busy streets and lots of houses that have been built around, you wouldn't necessarily realise that it was the back door into this big house. Okay, so it's one house with two entrances, and this is very, very significant in terms of the symbolism of the book, because it's the idea that that this idea of the dual nature of man, so having two sides to your personality. And as we go into the book, we slowly discover that Jekyll and Hyde are actually one and the same person, in the same way that these two different routes into the house are actually the same house. Okay, but at this point, Utterson doesn't realise that the door where the cheque was bought from is the back door into his friend Dr. Jekyll's house. But we haven't met Dr. Jekyll yet, and we haven't even heard the name mentioned yet. "You never asked about it, the place with the door?" said Mr. Utterson. "No, sir. I had a delicacy," was the reply. "I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the Day of Judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on top of the hill, and away the stone goes, starting others. And presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask." Queer in this respect contextually means unusual. In other words, Enfield is basically saying here, I didn't ask about it. I didn't ask about the relevance of the door because I strongly believe that not to start asking questions, because very often if you start asking questions, somebody gets really, really harmed or really hurt by it that perhaps was a little bit innocent in it. So Enfield is basically saying, I keep myself to myself and I don't start asking questions, so I don't know anything about the door, the relevance of it. "A very good rule too," said the lawyer. "But I have studied the place myself," continued Enfield. "It seems scarcely a house. There's no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one, but once in a great while the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor, and none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there's a chimney, which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure. The buildings are so packed together about that court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." So Enfield obviously has been a bit curious about this door then, wondering who lives there, and he's made a few observations. So he's obviously gone down backwards and forwards there a few times. So he says that the windows are clean, so it's well looked after. There's often smoke. There's often smoke at the chimney, which means that there is somebody that is living there that's resident there, but it's that there's no windows on the bottom floor, on the bottom story, which suggests that somebody wants secrecy, wants privacy. Now, if you think about windows in a building, that they're almost like eyes. In the sense that they kind of allow you to look in and out, and often in literature, the people's eyes are being described as windows to the soul. So if you think about a building as almost being like representative of a person, the windows are kind of like the eyes of the building. And if there are no eyes, no windows on the bottom floor, it suggests that there's almost no soul, or the fact that maybe somebody's kind of hiding their soul, they're hiding what's going on there. So there's a little bit of symbolism there to think about. The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then, "Enfield," said Utterson, "that's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," returned Enfield. "But for all that," continued the lawyer, "there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde." "Hmm," said Mr. Utterson. "What sort of man is he to see?" Now, this is important because obviously the name of the book is Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So we've got the first name of the first character of the title here that's introduced. So the reader's interest here will be really spiked once again. And Enfield goes on to explain what he looks like once again. "What sort of man is he to see? He's not easy to describe. There's something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, though I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment." When he's about seeing him this moment, it means in his head he can picture him. Now, as I said before, this is something significant that's always used when describing Mr. Hyde. The fact that there is something strange and it describes here as downright detestable. Detestable means horrendous, horrific, really unpleasant. So there's something downright detestable about the way this man looks. And yet Enfield tries to accurately describe why that is, but he can't. He says that there must be some kind of deformity. He refers to him as extraordinary looking, but he can't name anything out of the way. The reason why this is, and I'll tell this to you now because it's relevant later on, is that as the book goes on, we learn that Mr. Hyde is the kind of the evil side of Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll has done various experiments and transformations to try and remove the one small percentage of wickedness that Dr. Jekyll has within him, which means that the person that's created from that wickedness, Mr. Hyde, is fully evil. He's 100% evil. Now, even the most wicked of people normally have perhaps got a little bit of good within them. So the reason why Stevenson is perhaps implying that Edward Hyde is so deformed and so disfigured and there's something so unpleasant about his face is because there has never been a human being before who has been made up of 100% evil. Okay, so there is nothing positive about his personality or his way of thinking. Therefore, there is nothing positive about his face that can be seen. And this is why every time people describe him, they struggle to explain what it is that they find so detestable about his face, what makes them turn against him so quickly, so rapidly. Okay. Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obliviously under a weight of consideration. "You're sure he used a key?" he inquired at last. "My dear sir," began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it may seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it's because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you have been inexact in any point, you had better correct it." "I think you might have warned me," returned the other, with a touch of sullenness, "but I have been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a week ago." So Utterson seems to know whose name it is that was on the cheque, but he wants Mr. Enfield to be really, really certain on this, because of course if they start digging about in things that seem a little bit dodgy, a little bit unsavoury, it could well be incredibly damaging to Dr. Jekyll's reputation. Okay, so that's why he says, "Are you sure that he had a key? Are you sure he let himself in?" And Enfield gets a little bit annoyed, and he says, "I've been pedantically exact." If you're pedantic about something, it means that you are very, very precise, right? Because I think the two of them almost don't want to say what they're thinking because it could be quite serious in terms of the repercussions on Dr. Jekyll. But equally, they kind of both suspect whose name it was on the cheque and maybe what's going on. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but said never a word, and the young man presently resumed. "Here is another lesson to say nothing," said he. "I'm ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again." "With all my heart," said the lawyer. "I shake hands on that, Richard." So even now at the end of the chapter, we are not given the name of Dr. Jekyll. Okay, but Utterson, as we find out in the next chapter, that Utterson has got this name on the tip of his tongue. He wants to say it, but he and his cousin Richard Enfield decide that they've said too much. When he says about "I'm ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again." He's perhaps a little bit embarrassed that maybe he feels that he's said too much, that he's spoken out of turn because of the danger that this could have on the reputation of Dr. Jekyll. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 1.